spiderweb of fissures running through it. Then, with unstoppable momentum, the press pushed farther, and the core shattered, crumbling into pieces. The majority of them stayed in the bowl, and as the press continued its descent, the pieces were broken up smaller and smaller. Reversing the lever, Mark watched as the press opened a few inches, giving him just enough room to drop the shards that had escaped back into the bowl. There was no need for the tempered glass enclosure anymore, so he slid it to the side and then continued to crush the core into dust. The hardest part of the core was the external shell, and now that it had been cracked open and the largest pieces had been broken down, Mark began working the core by hand, using a pestle to pound away at it, making the shards smaller and smaller. After half an hour of steady work, he put the dust in a small box that had a filter in the middle. With gentle taps, he sifted the fine dust down into the bottom of the container, leaving the larger shards that he hadn't been able to break down behind. The dust stayed in that container while he poured the larger shards back into the mortar and pestle and began a second round of grinding. He repeated these steps 4 more times before he had finally gotten everything reduced to that very fine powder, filling the bottom of his container. The next step, though easier than crushing the core, was much more technical, and Mark reviewed everything he needed to do as he readied his equipment. 20. The next step in creating elixir was to mix a pinch of the powdered core with the base, which was easy enough. Then the mixture had to be heated to a specific temperature based on the salinity, and 3 different additives had to be mixed in at precise timings and heats. First was Esper, used for mana amplification. When mixed with the core powder, it would ensure the liquid remained stable and active as long as it wasn't exposed to oxygen. The second substance Mark had to mix in was Zerbin, a mana-activated sedative and muscle relaxant. Without it, anyone who consumed elixir would find their muscles seizing up, making it much harder for them to receive the benefits. The final ingredient was something called Factor X. Mark had no idea what it was or what sort of effect it had, but it was vital to the success of the potion. Factor X was present in almost every potion, but no matter how Mark had searched, he had never seen a description of what it actually was. He had even asked Abrams, who gave him a long look and then shrugged, clearly not wanting to answer. Regardless, Factor X seemed to be the key piece, allowing the other substances to meld together. Though the recipe was very simple, making elixir successfully was not. Absolute precision was needed to ensure not only the correct amounts of each substance, but also the shifting temperatures required to allow for proper mixing. Esper needed less heat, while Zerbin needed more, and the entire mixture had to be cooled before Factor X could be added. The problem was, as soon as the cooling process began, the Esper in the mixture would start to break down, and there was a window of less than a second to add the Factor X. Mark, calming himself as much as possible, retrieved the 3 secondary substances from the workstation storage and set them up on the counter. He was hesitant to begin, worried about wasting resources. Even though the workstation was well stocked, he had a limited amount of everything. While he had enough core powder for approximately 50 attempts, there were only 21 units of Factor X, meaning his number of attempts had been cut in half. Picking up one of the vials, he held up the blackish-red liquid to the light, watching the traces of crimson. Well, I guess it's now or never. Suppressing his nervousness, Mark put the vial back down, rubbed his sweaty palms on his shirt, and got to work. His first attempt was rather clumsy and, as expected, ended in abject failure. The main problem wasn't his timing, but rather his unfamiliarity with the machines. The entire process required 3 separate machines, all of which had to be manipulated using a set of controls that consisted of a small joystick, a series of buttons, and a dial. Mark could switch between the different machines by pressing the buttons, but there was a microsecond's delay. Furthermore, Mark simply wasn't very good at using the controls, as this was the first time he had worked on a potion that could not be exposed to air. Punching the unlocking code into the control panel, he heard the chamber with his failed potion hiss as air filled the vacuum it had created. There was a click and the casing opened, allowing Mark to take the failed potion out. It was a muddy gray, and the powerful mana that should have filled it was nowhere to be found. Putting the inert liquid aside, Mark considered for a moment, and then, instead of trying again, he filled a vial with base and clipped it into the chamber. He figured it was a better use of his time to get more familiar with the controls than to continue to attempt to make the potions. With his practice vial in place, he closed the casing and entered the command to lock it. This time there was a whoosh as all the air was pulled out of the chamber. Mentally reviewing the steps in his head, Mark began to execute them. He had control of 2 small robotic arms, as well as a syringe that could rotate between different substances. And for the next few hours, he immersed himself in dry run after dry run. He started by going through the process normally and noting down every single movement he made. Once he had everything broken out into a complete list of detailed steps that included where his hands should be when, Mark began to practice in earnest, focusing on completing the motions in a step-by-step process until they began to happen naturally, burned into his muscle memory. After a couple of hours of practice, his hands were starting to feel fatigued, so he stopped and took a break to meditate. After his meditation, he exercised, keeping his workout light to avoid burning through his biofuel. By that time, it was pretty late, so Mark headed to bed, falling into a dream where he fought swarms of devil hounds. He had just finished putting down a pack of 3 of them when a thought struck him, and even as the bushes started rustling, Mark closed his eyes and concentrated. In truth, he hadn't expected it to work, but he was pleasantly surprised when, a moment later, a group of 3 hunters emerged from the underbrush. Rather than eliminate them, Mark let himself be killed, complaining the entire time because of how long it took and how painful it was thanks to his regeneration. A few times he even thought about ending his own life in the dream, but something in him simply wouldn't allow him to do it. After he fell, the world warped and he reappeared, and he once again closed his eyes and concentrated. Instead of the 3 hunters that should have appeared, 9 devil hounds sprang from the undergrowth to attack him, surrounding him on all sides. This was the first time Mark had tried to shift his enemy in the dream, and after the devil hounds had fallen, he attempted to summon some mantises. A few seconds later, 5 of the large warrior-level Exlian charged out of the ruins, attempting to skewer him with their bone arms. Such a fight would have been completely impossible for Mark before, but his new regeneration ability allowed him to take devastating wounds and still survive. It was impossible to escape the attacks of all 5 of the mantises, so Mark was forced to trade hits for hits, allowing himself to be wounded in exchange for landing killing blows. It was a long and grueling fight, and by the time Mark was done, he was more than ready to wake up. Unfortunately, that was not to be, and as the last of the mantises fell, Mark knew he was in for a long night. His attempts to summon drones to fight failed, and Mark groaned when a screamer poked its head out and stared down at him from the roof of a ruined building. Mark spent the rest of the dream being badly abused by the screamer, though he did manage to land a few hits of his own. Despite the fact that Mark was alone in the wilderness, his days were busy. To a degree, this was out of necessity, as he didn't want to give himself time to think about his situation. While he was making the best of it, Mark could feel a faint creeping anxiety in the back of his mind, and in the occasional free moments between tasks, he found himself wondering if anyone was coming for him. He knew that dwelling on such things simply wasn't helpful, so he pushed on, burying himself in practicing alchemy. Mark's days soon fell into a simple rhythm: exercise in the morning, then an alchemy session, followed by a break for meditation at lunch, then more alchemy, and finally martial arts practice or tinkering with his mana suit in the evening. Mark spent 2 days in the mine, and on the 3rd day he ventured out once again, heading down into the valley to hunt for food. He moved slowly, avoiding the carnivorous plants and insects, and as he reached the valley floor, he spotted a drone in the distance. Rather than pass it by as he had the last time, Mark sprang into action, racing toward the drone with his mana-empowered steps. As he arrived in front of it, He lashed out with his fist, striking it on the top of its head, even as it tried to drop the bundle of grass it held in its mandibles. With a crack, its shell shattered, and Mark's fingers pulverized its brain, killing it instantly. As its death shriek rattled through the psychic network, Mark grabbed the corpse and, on a whim, scooped up the grass it had been carrying as well. As quickly as he had arrived, he retreated, wanting to get out of the area in case the drone's death cry attracted any attention. Retreating almost a mile, he hunkered down among some rocks on the slope of the mountain. With one hand on the drone's shell, Mark willed his shadow into action, and a moment later the drone was gone, completely devoured. He could feel the drone's energy replenishing his, and as he meditated there, his biofuel meter rose by 3. This meant that in order to fill up the meter completely, Mark would need 7 drones. That tracked with his experience absorbing the warrior-level devil hounds, as each of them had given him approximately 6 biofuel units. At the same time, Mark was slightly disappointed, as he didn't feel any improvement at all in his stats from devouring the drone's corpse. If drones really didn't add to his stats, they might not be worth consuming at all. But it could also be that he just needed significantly more of them before he would notice an effect. Heading back down into the valley, Mark continued to target the drones as he found them. Many of them seemed to be tracing roughly the same path, and by ranging along it, he was able to claim another 4 kills. Since his biofuel hadn't been empty before he started the hunt, those 4 kills completely filled his meter. He was just deciding whether he wanted to retreat to the mine when he felt a tickle through the psychic network and spotted another drone. This one was coming toward him, and on a whim, Mark decided to kill it as well. Not bothering to hide, he darted straight for it. It was holding a lump of earth in its mandibles, and when it saw Mark rushing toward it, it reared back, lifting its legs to try to ward him off. A moment later, it fell dead to the ground, and Mark stretched out his hand to engulf it. As the crunching rang out, Mark caught sight of a slight glimmer in the chunk of earth that had fallen from the drone's grasp as it died. As his shadow finished devouring the drone's body, Mark picked up the clump of dirt and squeezed lightly, breaking off much of the excess. There was a stone inside that glimmered as it caught the light, and Mark could sense a dense mana inside it. Turning it over, he continued to brush off the loose dirt until he was holding a rough stone approximately the size of his fist. A piece of the stone had been chipped away, and the chipped spot shone brightly every time Mark shifted the stone. Though he had never seen a raw mana stone before, Mark had no trouble identifying it. Mana stones were one of the staples of life in New Emery, and Mark could only imagine what one of this size would go for. It was likely the drone had been bringing the mana stone back to its nest, and from how moist the dirt was, it looked as if the stone had been pulled from the earth recently, which got Mark wondering if there were more. Putting it in the pouch with the grasses he had shoved in there earlier, Mark tried to retrace the drone's path, but he didn't know anything about tracking and was quickly lost. Mark thought about getting Mine, but she was back at the base, having elected not to come with him on his hunt. He was just turning back when the psychic network lit up, and he saw a dozen Exlian moving through the underbrush some distance away. They didn't seem fast enough to be devil hounds, and Mark really didn't want the attention that fighting them would bring, so he carefully retreated. Unfortunately, they spotted him and shifted direction, heading straight for him. This was the one downside to being connected to the psychic network. Though Mark could use it to see Exlian, they seemed to be able to use it to see him as well. Noticing that they were speeding up, Mark gritted his teeth and got ready for a fight. When the first four-armed hunter emerged from the trees, Mark's hand was already there, slicing through its neck with ease. The second hunter met a similar fate as Mark drove forward, his suit allowing him to move too fast for the hunter to react. The other hunters let out roars and raced toward him, each eager to be the first to taste his blood. What met them was a newly reinforced suit of armor and 2 deadly bone blade arms. Mark danced through their attacks, his fingers flicking this way and that as he laid open their bodies. Though his attacks didn't always manage to kill, he had only to touch the hunter's skin to split it open, and after a furious few minutes of fighting, all the hunters lay dead or dying around him. He quickly eliminated those he had failed to kill, his fingers piercing through their skulls to destroy their brains. Even as he did so, Mark was already activating his shadow. The Devil Hounds had given him a slight increase in his speed, and he was curious about what the warrior-level Exlian hunters would give him. In the course of the fight, Mark had burned through 3 biofuel units, and the first of the hunters he absorbed went to replacing them. As the shadow devoured the second hunter, Mark felt a trickle of energy racing down his spine and paused, clarity setting in. When he lacked energy, the Exlian he consumed went straight to his biofuel, filling it back up. It seemed that it was only after he had reached his maximum biofuel that the devoured Exlian's power would be added to his stats. Just like the Devil Hounds, the hunters appeared to be adding to Mark's speed, causing a slow but steady improvement in how quickly he could move his body. When he got to the last corpse, Mark hesitated and then elected not to devour it. Instead, he brought it with him as he retreated back up the mountain to Felwer Mine. 21. There were a few things Mark was curious about and wanted to test. The first was whether he'd be able to find any usable parts. Though he had been working with Abrams for over a year, there were still many parts of Exlian bodies Mark wasn't familiar with. Since he had significant time on his hands, he thought adding alchemical butchering back onto his training schedule would be a good way to both advance in the field and pass the time. Additionally, he was curious as to whether, after removing some of the more important organs, he'd still benefit from devouring the rest. If he did, it'd be like killing 2 birds with 1 stone, as he'd be able to harvest the most important alchemical ingredients while also improving his stats. A third, very real though minor benefit would be not having to deal with the corpses afterward. Mark didn't have a freezer warehouse and didn't really fancy having chunks of Exlian flesh rotting in the mine. He also didn't have a butchering workstation, so after dropping the hunter's corpse outside the mine, Mark set to work scavenging parts from the base to build himself a sturdy table. He started by grabbing one of the large tables from the mess hall. It had a wooden top, which would help avoid contamination of the alchemical ingredients. However, he was concerned that it wouldn't be heavy-duty enough to support the weight of some of the larger Exlian. There was a metal table in the kitchen, and after looking it over, Mark began to carve it up, his fingers slicing through the metal with ease. He separated the 4 legs and carried them, along with the top, out to where the wooden table stood. After flipping that table over, Mark cut the metal one down to size so that it would fit underneath the wooden tabletop and between the wooden legs. Using the extra metal he had cut off, he fashioned supports and then welded the metal legs back into place. Finally, he banded the metal and wooden legs together with metal strips. When he was done, he had 2 tables stacked together, a metal one on the inside supporting a wooden one on top of it. It wasn't pretty to look at, but Mark didn't need pretty. He needed functional. It took some doing to get the table out of the mess hall, and when he arrived at the mine, he stopped, his expression ugly. He hadn't actually considered how he was going to get his large table through the small door, and it was clear that there was no way it was going to fit as it was. With a groan, Mark carefully took the entire thing back apart, unscrewing the legs of the wooden table, and carried everything in piece by piece before reassembling it inside the mine. It took him a full 2 hours longer than he had intended, but when he finished, Mark was quite pleased. The table was 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, big enough to place 2 Exlian corpses on without trouble. Mark headed back outside to where he had dumped the hunter's corpse, grabbed it, and brought it in. He had none of the fancy equipment Abrams's butchering station had, but he didn't let that stop him, and soon the hunter had been laid open. Mark's primary goal was to become more familiar with hunters' corpses, trying to understand the creature's strengths and weaknesses as best he could. He had a growing suspicion that he was going to be out in the wilderness for a long while, and if he wanted to survive, he felt he needed to understand the world around him better than he did. Exilian were an ever-changing species, and the amount of variation between Exilian of the same type was astounding. So the more Mark knew about them, the easier it would be to deal with surprises. By the time he had finished his detailed examination, the corpse had been reduced to a bloody mess, and the organs that could be used for alchemy were spoiled. Deciding he'd harvest from the next one, Mark placed his hand in the wide-open chest cavity, and his shadow surged, crawling up the table and enveloping the ragged corpse eagerly. He was gratified to learn that his shadow didn't mind the state of the corpse, and a moment later, all signs of the Exilian were gone, including the blood that had covered his hands. Looking at the spotless table, he smirked. Well, that's convenient. His energy full, Mark considered heading back out to hunt for more Exilian, but he was wary of alerting them to his presence, so he stayed inside for the next 2 days. He was getting better and better at controlling the robotic arms and faster at executing the motions he needed. Toward the end of the second day, he decided to give mixing an elixir another shot, and rather than using a vial of base by itself, he added a pinch of the powdered core to it. After shaking the vial up, he stuck it into the vacuum chamber and began the process. He was surprisingly nervous as he engaged the lock and set the vacuum, but he had practiced the motions enough times that they had become familiar, and soon his muscle memory kicked in and his shaky motions smoothed out. The secondary ingredients were ready to deploy, and as Mark monitored the heat carefully, he added each in turn. Though he felt good about his performance, he still ended up with a tube of inert gray sludge, and with a frown, he pulled the failed elixir out of the machine and shook it. The mana it should have contained had dissipated as soon as he had added the factor X. And though he wasn't exactly sure why, he thought it might have something to do with how quickly the potion had cooled. Creating elixir required a frustratingly precise control of the mixture's temperature at all stages, and while Mark's control of the machines had improved considerably, he hadn't been practicing with active temperature changes. With a new goal, Mark took some time to redesign his practice regime and then went to bed. The next day, he crept down the mountain, moving slowly to avoid disturbing any of the insect swarms that were buzzing around in the pre-dawn air. Mark's goal for his hunt was threefold. First, he needed to refill his biofuel. Second, he wanted to collect a variety of corpses to study. And third, he was interested to see if he could discover where the raw mana stone had come from. Felwar Mine was an ore mine, not a mana stone mine, though according to the reports he had read, mana stones had been found tucked among the veins of ore. While it was possible that the one he had retrieved was singular, judging from the size of it, it was more likely that it had come from a vein. And if Mark could find that vein, he would probably find other stones as well. Mana stones could be processed in much the same way that cores could, and would drastically improve the effects of most potions. Mark was also interested in making sure that he had power sources for equipment like his watch, so having more stones would always be better. Unfortunately, he had no luck and didn't see a drone carrying a mana stone all day. Instead, what he found was trouble, or more accurately, trouble found him. It started with a small group of hunters that combed quietly through the brush. Mark ambushed them, successfully killing all three before devouring their corpses. He had been paying careful attention, and he had a feeling that after another 25 warrior-level Exilian, he'd see an improvement in his speed. As a result, it was with some eagerness that he ambushed another group of hunters, 6 this time, and devoured them as well. Eager to improve his speed, Mark began to hunt in earnest, killing every Exilian he came across. He only noticed something strange when he spotted 2 groups of hunters, both small. One was north of him, the other east, and after picking one of the groups and starting to rush over, Mark was surprised to see the group he was chasing after retreating. This was wildly unusual behavior, as Exilian simply didn't retreat as a matter of principle. Warning bells went off in Mark's head and he slowed. When he checked the psychic network again, a frown flashed across his face. The 2 groups of Exilian were approximately the same distance away from him as they had been before, meaning that as he'd moved, The other group of hunters had followed after him without closing in. Taking a few steps back, as if he were turning to chase the group to the east, Mark saw it retreat as well. At the same time, the hunters he had originally been chasing retraced their steps, still maintaining distance. Well, this isn't good. He was too far away to see them directly because of the thick forest, so he abandoned his hunt, retreating to the west. Yet he had only gone 100 feet when he saw a group of hunters appearing in front of him. They were surrounding him. The only direction that seemed open was east, but Mark didn't need to head that direction to know it was likely closed off as well. By this time, close to 16 hunters were showing up in the psychic network, and Mark realized he had been baited into a trap. Rather than wait for them to spring it, Mark took a deep breath and charged forward, no longer worrying about avoiding attention. As he crashed through the woods, branches whipped at his suit, snapping as he barreled straight through them. The hunters in his path started to retreat, and when they did, Mark shifted his direction, heading northwest to slip between the two groups. At the same time, he sped up, sprinting at maximum speed. He could feel the heat in the synthetic muscles of his suit as they worked overtime to carry him through the forest. The hunters, sensing imminent escape, tried to close in, but Mark was moving too fast for them, and a moment later, he slipped out of their net. Just as he was starting to celebrate, he noticed the presence of Exlian only 1,000 feet ahead. He was moving so quickly that he had trouble shifting directions, and within moments, he barreled straight into a large group of hunters led by a Hulk. Drawing his sword, Mark hacked at the closest hunter, and his blade tore the creature in half. 2 other hunters launched themselves at him, and he managed to dodge past one and kill the other with a stab. That slowed him down, however, and hearing a roar from beside him, he brought his blade up to block. The Hulk's fist slammed into him, and Mark felt the shock deep in his bones as he was hurled sideways. His body slammed into a tree with enough force that the trunk splintered, and he felt his armor crack. He had no time to assess the damage, though, because the Hulk was still after him. Pushing himself from the trunk with a groan, Mark threw himself backward, rolling on the ground as the Hulk's claws tore through the tree like it was paper. He had managed to keep a grip on his sword, but so many hunters were swarming him that there was no space to use it. Trying to get to his feet as he warded off the hunter's claws, Mark felt the earth shake and realized that the Hulk was charging him. Though not as immediately deadly as a screamer, the Hulk was just as dangerous thanks to its size and strength. If one of its attacks caught him squarely, Mark was positive it would be game over. So he tried to retreat out of its path, cutting his way through the swarming hunters. It had been less than a minute since the fight started, but already Mark's suit was in shreds. The damage to the underlying structure wasn't too bad, but the armor plates had nearly all been pulled off or pierced through, and Mark knew that if he didn't get free soon, he would be in tremendous trouble. Barely avoiding the Hulk's charge, Mark cut down a hunter and saw the forest in front of him. Without hesitation, he fled for his life, desperately running up the side of the mountain. There was a loud roar behind him, then an answering howl that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. During his trip to hunt in the valley, Mark had realized that the Exlian all had their own hunting grounds. The devil hounds tended to range in the mountains, while the hunters spent more time down in the deep valley. The large fight must have attracted the devil hounds' attention, because a pack of 13 was now sweeping toward him. Mark's legs burned as he forced himself to speed up once more, and his lungs felt like they were going to burst as he desperately tried to suck in air. Thanks to the empowerment of his suit, he barely managed to outpace the hunters, but that still left the devil hounds in his way. Mark slammed into them at full speed and heard something in his suit snap as he lowered his shoulder and rammed a leaping devil hound. He was moving so quickly the Exlian's body popped, showering him in blood. Barely slowing down, Mark continued through the pack, suffering multiple attacks that left him covered in bloody wounds. Then the hunters arrived, with the Hulk trailing behind them, and they set upon the devil hounds. Though Exlian were all categorized as the same species, Those who came from different nests were mortal enemies, and that was exactly what Mark was counting on. As the fight erupted behind him, Mark retreated to the mine as quickly as he could. He was afraid that the Hulk would follow, but by the time he made it to the outer wall, it had long been left behind. Mark's wounds had healed during his frantic run, but his biofuel had been mostly spent, and his suit was a complete wreck. Though he would eventually have to go out again, Mark was wary about getting spotted, so he decided that he would wait as long as possible. He had to repair his suit, so keeping busy wasn't a problem, and he hunkered down, immersing himself in fixing the broken armor and studying alchemy. The next day, however, he was checking the psychic network when he spotted some faint movement at the edge of his perception of the base outside. Mark's awareness covered the majority of the base, though when he was in the mine, a few spots at the edge of the southern wall were outside his range. He was picking up movement at the very edge of his range, but rather than stepping out of the mine, Mark remained where he was, watching quietly. After close to half an hour, just as he was becoming impatient, he sensed two Exlian presences creeping into the base from the south. They moved slowly, as if searching for something. And as soon as they sensed Mark, they froze and then retreated rapidly. Worried, Mark, who wasn't wearing his suit, threw open the door and hurried outside. As fast as he could, he raced to the southern wall and climbed on top of it, staring down the mountain. In the far distance, he could see two Exlian retreating, scampering through the rocks as they headed down into the valley. Though it was hard to make out from a distance what they were, Mark thought they looked like hunters, which didn't bode well for him. He knew that hunters were consummate trackers, and it was likely that after seeing their brethren hunted in the valley below, they had tracked him back to the mine. 22. Mark stood on the southern wall in silence, even long after the two Exlian hunters had vanished from view. It would be impossible to catch up with them, and even if he could, killing them would likely just draw others. His only hope was that their packs were mostly thinned, as when they returned, it would undoubtedly be in force. What was strange to Mark was that the hunters, who were typically solitary creatures, seemed to be moving in groups. That spoke to more powerful Exlian leading them. And Mark was rather worried that those Exlian would come with the hunters the next time they arrived. As much as he wanted to retreat into the mine, shut the door, and distract himself with his alchemy, Mark knew the Exlian would come for him, so he needed to make sure he was ready. Heading back to the mine, Mark got his suit on. As he buckled his helmet, he mentally reviewed his options. The base's defenses were shot, which left him with himself, his weapons, and Mime. If, that was, he could get the cat to cooperate. Mime had been venturing into the depths of the mine with increasing frequency to do who knew what. And it wasn't like you could control a cat, but hopefully she'd be around when the attack came. After considering his options for defenses, Mark settled on a relatively simple, if risky, plan. Rather than wait for the hunters to come find him, he decided to go find them. While fighting the enemy out in the open was dangerous, Mark was confident he'd be able to make a strategic retreat, fighting as he went. That would hopefully keep him from being surrounded while allowing him to eliminate the enemy without worrying about damage to his base. Of course, if Mark was right and the hunters were being organized by a more powerful Exlian, then he was playing with fire, as engaging with a powerful Exlian on its home turf was doubly dangerous. Mark didn't feel like he had a choice, however, and preferred action to waiting around like a fish in a barrel. Mime was nowhere to be seen, so Mark headed for the door. He had just stepped outside when he felt a weight on his shoulder, and glancing over, he saw Mime sitting there. She was staring at him with a severe look, as if she knew what he was about to do. With a sheepish grin, Mark locked the door behind him and gestured to the south. "Want to go hunting? I could really use your help," Especially if you could track those 2 hunters who were scouting us. Mime considered him for a long time, then nodded. She leaped from his shoulder, and he gave chase as she bounded through the base. Even with his mana-empowered suit, he could hardly keep up with her, and more than once he completely lost sight of her, only for her to pop up a few hundred feet ahead, waiting for him to catch up. When she reached the southern wall, she paused for just a moment, her head low to the ground as she sniffed out the scent. And then she took off, heading down the mountain. Mark followed behind her, trying to move as quietly as he could, while still keeping up with her quick trot. Oddly, Mime made no special effort to avoid the carnivorous plants that dotted the landscape. Instead, as she moved past, the plants would curl up tightly, withdrawing as far as they could from her path. The air was strangely silent as well, and the normal hum of insects was nowhere to be found. Mark was too focused on the coming battle to pay attention to these things. When they reached the bottom of the mountain 45 minutes later,